Brett makes his graceful way to the podium and is mic'd up, I just remind you that he is a leading contemporary British silversmith. He's a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths, a freeman of the Cutlers Company in Sheffield, and a past chairman of the Goldsmiths Craft and Design Council. He designs and hand makes sterling silver tableware and candlesticks from his workshop in Sheffield. He has way too many awards and honours for me to list, but just say in the last 3 years, he's exhibited his work in Finland, Munich, New York and Antwerp. You can see him in the V&A in London, in the Cutlers Company, and in the House of Lords. So I was great privilege to welcome Brett. Thank you.
Well, the trouble is, and the trouble is actually that being the last on is that so much of maybe what I was going to has been touched on already. But I don't think necessarily that's a bad thing because what I thought I would do, or what Gordon asked me to do, was to concentrate on the themes that have been developed so far this morning, but with specific reference really to artisan silversmiths as opposed to the wider, perhaps, trade, and which I know Peter and Richard have maybe talked about a little bit. Far from the trouble is really, I think it's very positive really. Artisan silversmithing, as far as I'm concerned, is alive and kicking in 2016. There are plenty of opportunities out there for artisan silversmiths, and although the market is small, as a group of artisan silversmiths, we are small too. The market is bigger than we need it to be, and I believe it is getting bigger. I earn my living, and always have done, purely by designing and making my own work, and I sell my work not just in the UK, and, as you've mentioned, but across Europe and around the world. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a fascinating, hugely rewarding and endlessly challenging way of living a life and working and earning a living. And it's a way of life that I think I would have no hesitation in recommending to anybody, except for the fact that perhaps it isn't for everybody. Is there perhaps, I wonder, something absurd about being a silversmith in the 21st century? Because it does take a particular kind of character and attitude of mind to even attempt it, really. The market is small, and frankly, everybody wears jewellery, eats bread, drinks alcohol, wears shoes, is interested in fashion. But how many people buy silverware or even want to? So what is the artisan silversmith? Who are we? Well, first and foremost, we are typically self-employed. Not necessarily one-man bands, but often so to begin with. And as such, we have to embrace the entire task of creation, taking responsibility for the conception of ideas, the design and making of the work, and the selling of the finished pieces. And it's absolutely fundamental, I think, to recognise that success depends not just on what the artisan makes, because life is, for him, much more complex than that. At the very heart of any success, there are two equally important elements that the artisan silversmith has to reconcile and fuse together into a seamless whole. And I might characterise them as the vision, or the voice, Gordon touched on this a minute or two ago, and the mechanics. One's voice is not just the ability to generate original new ideas, but the education to apply them to design. And the mechanics are the tools of business and the ability to apply them so that one's voice is heard. The successful artisan silversmith must have an understanding of the equal importance of both and the willingness to successfully engage equally with both halves of that equation. Now, the current educational emphasis on design, and we've heard something about that this morning, and a more general temptation I see really to see all forms of creativity as art, leads, I think, to a rather naive acceptance to that notion of Emerson's that if a man makes a better mousetrap or writes a better book, etc., then the world will beat a path to his door. But this is the 21st century. We live in an advanced and highly competitive capitalist society. Business skills are not some sort of optional extra that you can dally with on some short course or get a clutch of self-help manuals. The artisan silversmith makes work that no one needs out of expensive materials, by hand, and with limited financial resources. There are few people on the planet who need better built business skills than artisan silversmiths. And secondly, the artisan silversmith must have a strength of character. Now, this is a bit of an amorphous kind of concept, isn't it? But good design is so often the reflection of an individual personality. One person's idea of how the world should look and how things should be. And being an artisan silversmith is more an attitude of mind. It's a way of life. It's not just a job. It's suited to some people. It's not suited to others. Because the life of an artisan silversmith is tough. We have to be selfish and arrogant. We have to be hard-working and disciplined and self-critical and very dogged and determined that what we are doing is really, really, really important. Because success, however you define it, is not quickly won. This is a long game. I think we all know that. And it's not for everyone. There are no rock star silversmiths. Diamond-studded Rolls Royces, maybe, but... Nevertheless, the rewards and satisfactions are very real, and I'd venture to suggest that artisan silversmiths will always exist. Whether someone crafts their future or not, whether the universities teach this as a subject or not, artisan silversmiths will always exist. Now, those of us who understand through experience what it means to be an artisan silversmith, however, do perhaps see an obvious and widening gap between the current educational theory and the education and training needed to prepare one for the realities of life as a silversmith today, and suggests that those entering the business are increasingly ill-equipped to succeed on leaving college. If I can quote just briefly from a report published by the Crafts Council in 2014 entitled Our Future is in the Making. See what they did there? That was a good... in the 6 years, 2007 to 2013, student participation in craft-related GSCEs fell by 25%, while in higher education the number of craft courses fell 46%. I imagine that is continuing, that's a trend that's continuing. And it can't have really escaped many of our notices, really, that not only schools but also colleges are getting rid of large amounts of equipment and high-quality tools, which I believe is now called educational surplus. Some of us, of course, have benefited from this. We've been able to buy some of this. But just these two factors alone, I think, reflect a current educational view of a subject emphasis that sees design as an intellectual process separate from the content of making. And although this is not a new state of affairs, but one that's been gathering momentum for, I would say, at least the last 20 years or so, it presents a problem for those of us who wish to see a flourishing of silversmithing in the UK, because leaving aside the very modest numbers of silversmithing apprenticeships offered by the Goldsmiths Company, the only route available into this business is through a BA degree or similar course. And frankly, for the would-be silversmith aged 18 or so, these courses are the only game in town. Furthermore, the disappearance of most of the larger-scale silversmithing manufacturing companies means that self-employment as an artisan silversmith is often the only career path open to them when they graduate. So the issue of how we are to support or create the successful artisan silversmith is one which is, after all, of increasing relevance. But if it is to have any credibility, then it has to be discussed in a language whose terms are clearly defined. And as Grant, I think, asked earlier about what is an artisan silversmith, I've been in business now, my career's lasted for 35 years, and I've been described as an artisan, an artist craftsman, a designer maker, an applied artist, a studio silversmith, a metalsmith, and a maker. And now, artisan silversmith. So why so many changing labels? Are they all interchangeable? Well, perhaps so, but what are they intended to convey? Do they perhaps indicate a level of uncertainty and confusion about who we are, what skills we have, and what we do? Well, those of you who know your Ruskian will perhaps interpret these labels as indicating an attempt to ennoble the enterprise, perhaps citing that oft-quoted phrase, manual labour is no degradation when it is governed by the intellect. And as I've said, for most, the only route into this business is now through university. But let's not kid ourselves. These universities are hardly the growers of academe. But they are universities. And as such, our subject is being taught and administered alongside other subjects, perhaps more suitable to a traditional university education environment. I wonder how long it will be before alternative organisations emerge who are leaner and perhaps more suitable. Now, the definition of an artisan silversmith suggested by Gordon is that the modern artisan silversmith has to be a flexible entrepreneurial manager, bringing together original design, craft, and a panoply of disparate business skills to create success in the 21st century economy. Seems obvious enough, hardly revolutionary, but then it's perhaps a definition of an artisan, applicable in general terms to artisan jewellers, bakers, brewers, and cobblers, but not perhaps specifically to artisan silversmiths. Are there perhaps considerations specific to silversmithing that is fundamental to address? And what differences are there in the skill set required to create success in the 21st century from those in Renaissance Italy or any period in between? Is it a ridiculous notion, I wonder, to question the current symbiotic link between silversmithing and jewellery? The two disciplines have some commonality, but less so than I think is commonly acknowledged. Even at a material level, they barely use the same materials. And in terms of the required spatial thinking, techniques used, tools employed, space required, processes undertaken, and ultimate use, there are few correlations. In terms of education and cultural hinterland, the jeweller and the silversmith may not be worlds apart. But in terms of training and interpretation, I would suggest that they require very different approaches. And I wonder if the current educational institutions appreciate this distinction. In my experience, one of the biggest hindrances that contemporary silversmithing faces is a recognition and an acknowledgement that it is a separate, genuinely separate discipline. And I'd like to suggest that there are at least three critical issues that impact on this, and that perhaps embracing them will help inform a successful attempt to craft a future for the artisan silversmith. Gender, training, and expectation, I would suggest, represent the biggest areas of difference between the contemporary artisan silversmith and his historical counterpart. I say his, but I'd invite you to notice that perhaps the 21st century artisan silversmith is more typically female. And I base that observation really on my connections with a wide range of silversmiths across the UK and Europe. But also, most particularly on my experience of mentoring 64 young silversmiths through the Yorkshire Art Space Silversmithing Studio, which I set up 16 years ago. And it's worth noting that of those 64 young silversmiths, only 5 have been male. Does this, I wonder, have an impact on the way in which the traditional institutions and organisations view this new generation? I fear it perhaps does. There is, it seems to me, no earthly reason why the sex of a silversmith should have any relevance at all. But perhaps, because our discipline has traditionally been seen as a male occupation, it does seem to. I wonder, for example, whether this gender issue has an impact on the education and training offered to young graduates. And I use the word training advisedly here. I'm not sure it's really appropriate. We're not bloody performing dogs, after all, are we? Technical instruction, with all its rather archaic connotations, still seems a slightly better term. So is there perhaps still an unspoken and unacknowledged belief that technical ability, a high degree of skill and precision, is a quality more suited to the male craftsman? That somehow women are out of place in workshops? Again, I fear there perhaps might be. In the mid-1970s, and I appreciate that's 40 years ago, but it's not that long ago. In the mid-1970s, when West Dean was initially being converted into a craft and design college, no provision whatsoever was made for female toilets. Why do we need those? This is a craft college. We don't expect to take female students. It seems to me that the current technical instruction to young would-be silversmiths is woefully inadequate. Universities, even the new ones, aspire to education, not training. And perhaps this, combined with a faint, unacknowledged notion that women don't belong in workshops, has produced a system that's still failing to address our subject adequately. It seems to me that if students leave college with an aspiration to become an artisan silversmith, they should have more than a cursory knowledge of the technology they need to master, and they should be fired with an inspiration and technical confidence to start on a career, with enthusiasm and optimism. Without at least that, there will inevitably be diminished expectations of what an artisan silversmith can achieve and a lack of appreciation of the qualities that they must have and the skills that they must learn to ensure a long and rewarding career. And there does seem to be a notion that their careers will be short. Today's young graduate aspiring to be a silversmith seems too often to be expected to hit the ground running after college. It seems to me that far too often young, inexperienced graduates are offered opportunities far beyond their competence to deal with. Whether these offers come from those with a rather amateurish understanding of what abilities they have on completion of a modern BA course, or whether they come from those willing to exploit their naivety, I hesitate to judge. But sometimes, when I go round degree shows, new designers, or indeed Goldsmiths Fair, I'm reminded of all those natural history documentaries showing packs of killer whales waiting offshore for the seal pups to launch themselves into the ocean. I believe 1 in 10 survives their first contact with the real world. Oh, something else for you to look at. Becoming a successful artisan is a long process. Young graduates need to be told that and be given the confidence to pick and choose carefully how they want to develop without being made to feel that they're failures if they haven't got a piece in a V&A within a year of leaving college, or afraid that they'll be forgotten if they don't take part in an exhibition purporting to point out to a breathless public the stars of the future. Yes, indeed, there are some prodigies, but one size does not fit all, and it's important that any attempt to craft their future does not prescribe a rigid programme for success or failure, but rather support them in developing the possibility of success. So just to finish, I think last point I'd like to make is that the key to the current success and the future prosperity of artisan silversmithing is in its diversity. And any organisation wishing to support aspiring silversmiths should encourage this diversity. A prescriptive dialogue about what constitutes success is likely to achieve the opposite. What is required is an understanding that artisan silversmiths need an individual voice, a high degree of technical knowledge and ability, and an entrepreneurial enthusiasm. What is required is an aspiration to equip and enable rather than to craft.